Okay, so we're going to have another review before Rinpoche's class, and let's start out with any questions that you may have, any doubts if you've been reading, or questions about the class. Anyone have anything? Venerable, have everything been clear to you? Venerable Ingrid? Not Ingrid, was
Ingeborg.
Ingeborg, not Ingrid. Ingeborg.
And you said Yeshe Choden.
Yeshe Churinoff.
I missed it because I'm so jet lagged that kind of space out and fall asleep.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Okay. So, anyone? How about Frank? You have any questions that you?
Oh, I have one small question. I was reading ahead in the next section, and there's a statement in there that since only one Buddha appears in a universe of 3 billion world systems, he's the only one. And so I was wondering about the relative proliferation of Buddhas, by what they mean by that, as opposed to, is that in this time or in all times, or?
I think what that's referring to, when it says one Buddha appears, when it says 3 billion world systems, you know what that's referring to, first of all? When the Buddhas arrive in the world as universal teachers, they always perform the 12 deeds. And one of those deeds is taking the aspect of attaining enlightenment under the Bodhi tree and so forth. It's quite a remarkable thing. It's not something that has happened since Shakyamuni Buddha appeared in the world, even though there may have been other manifestations of Buddha. There's only one at any one time that's in a world system that's recognized as the universal teacher, Buddha. So of those 12 deeds, when the emanation body, the Nirmanakaya, the highest emanation body, comes to the world systems, the emanation body emanates in what's called, the Tibetans say Tong Sum, which literally means 3,000. We talked about this before, sort of in mathematical notations now, we'd say 1,000 times 1,000 times 1,000, or 1,000 cubed, a billion world systems. The emanation comes, but it's staggered according to what the development of the people are at that time. You may be taking birth in one and teaching turning the wheel of Dharma in another, passing away in another. But at that same period, the one universal teacher appears in these billion world systems that are all connected with us. They have a similar kind of karma to us. And there are other world systems beyond that, where other Buddhas are appearing or not, depending on if it's a dark age, or which is more often the case. So even though Shakyamuni Buddha appeared in the world, it doesn't mean he is the only Buddha in general. There are other Buddhas that emanate. Even at the time of the Buddha, even at the time of Shakyamuni, there were other emanations of Buddha appearing in the world, but not saying, I am Buddha. Perhaps Maitreya was either an emanation of Shakyamuni or actually emanation of the future Buddha, Maitreya, but not saying, I am Buddha Maitreya, I'm equal footing to this fellow over here that you're calling Siddhartha or Shakyamuni. So in order to give precedence to that teaching of one universal teacher, the other Buddhas don't proclaim themselves to be universal teachers. So I think that's what's being referred to. There's just one. And anyone to...
Considering multiple emanations at different levels of, for different teachings in different worlds, at the same time as being the same Buddha.
Yes. So that one Nirmanakaya, that one mind stream, emanates all of those at the same time. And it said that even now, any one particular Buddha, one Dharmakaya, emanates countless emanations in different world systems, not necessarily turning the wheel of Dharma, not showing the aspect of being Buddha, but different emanations, so that to emanate a billion different teachers is sort of like nothing compared to the numberless emanations they emanating anyway. Okay. Mark, you have a question?
I think it was on Friday night, Rinpoche was talking about, and I didn't get the end, relying on the teaching but not the teacher, relying on the meaning but not the words, relying on the definitive teachings as opposed to the interpretable, and then the last two sets that I didn't get.
So these are called the four reliances, or some other translation of it. So what the Buddha was emphasizing here was that, what is it that we should depend upon or rely upon? Is it like someone who is a very charismatic teacher, beautiful, kind of emanation? The Buddha said, don't rely on the person or the charisma of the person. Rely on the teaching, first of all. So that's why even though your teacher might look old and decrepit or not particularly charismatic or whatever, you shouldn't rely upon that kind of thing that we often are attracted to in the world, someone that looks more attractive, sort of the Hollywood star kind of thing. That's not the thing to rely on. Then of the teaching, don't rely on the mere, what would we say in English, euphony, the pleasant soundingness of the words. Rely on the meaning. Is that the second one you had? Maybe you didn't have it in, yeah? So here, even you hear the teaching, so you come and you're able to disengage yourself from just being mainly affected, relying upon someone who looks attractive or charismatic. Then in listening to the words, some of the words might sound very attractive to you, the cadence, the way that they're structured and so forth, or just in terms of your mind being happy or not. Oh, this sounds good. This teacher tells me I can do what I want, just go for it. This other teacher is telling me I have to have renunciation and forget about them. So what one has to check is not just the sweet soundingness of the words on all these different levels, whether it be on the level of grammar and how sweet it sounds to your ears, or on the level of whether it pleases your mind. Check the meaning. Rely on the meaning, not just the words themselves. Then thirdly, when you check the meaning, there are different ways that the Buddha teaches. The Buddha teaches sometimes in a way which is leading people to something which he can't say explicitly because their minds are not ready. So those teachings are said to be interpretable. We add that extra syllable in there. Sometimes people should say interpretable, or interpretative teachings. At other times he speaks directly and tells it as it is, let's say. Those are what are called definitive teachings. So we've talked about this in other contexts, but for those of you who haven't heard it before, there's different levels of understanding of what that means. Rinpoche went through two different explanations. Sometimes the interpretable just means, the definitive sometimes just means that which can be taken literally, and the interpretable means that which you have to interpret. Sometimes that's the meaning of definitive and interpretable. But in the highest sense, it has a slightly more profound meaning. It means that the definitive teachings are those teachings that explicitly talk about the meaning of emptiness, ultimate truth. This is how things actually are. In any teaching, even if it's literally correct, that's talking about the conventional reality, let's say the Bodhisattva's deeds or karma, which are things that are literally correct, but are conventional truths, from the highest philosophical view, from the Prasangika middle way school, those are called interpretable, because eventually you're going to have to interpret those statements in view of ultimate reality. So there's different meanings of that, okay? Finally, and this is the one that you were talking about, Lama Sopa Rinpoche made some comments at the very end of yesterday's lecture also about this. So there's slightly different interpretation. Sometimes what it says is, with respect to, now you've honed down, I'm not relying just on the charisma of the teacher, I'm going to rely on the meaning, on the teachings. And of the teachings, not just the words, but the meaning. Then of the meaning, not just the interpretable, but the definitive meaning. Because this is what you eventually want to realize to bring yourself to attain liberation, the meaning of emptiness. And then how do you rely on that definitive meaning? Do you rely on it with, well, in this case, let's say use Lama Tsong Rinpoche's one interpretation. It's not the only, it's not just Rinpoche's interpretation, but one way of interpreting this. Should you rely upon this meaning with a, I think Rinpoche was saying, with a sense consciousness or with the mental consciousness? Oh, it should be with the mental consciousness, because that's what realizes emptiness, not your sense. You don't realize emptiness with your sense consciousnesses. Only a Buddha can realize emptiness with all of his consciousnesses, right? But in another interpretation, one that perhaps is a little more common, is it said you shouldn't rely on a conceptualizing consciousness, such as an inference. Although that can realize emptiness, you know, by means of a mental image, by thinking, by means of a mental image with conceptual thought, you can realize emptiness, but that's not what you should ultimately rely upon. You should rely upon exalted wisdom, which realizes that object, emptiness, directly, not by means of a mental image. So I'm not sure. I think sometimes that's where this particular exalted wisdom we call yeshe is very similar to the word yishe, which is, Rinpoche was interpreting it as mental consciousness. But in other contexts it says you should not rely upon a conceptual consciousness. That's the thing not to rely on. Whereas Lama Tsong Rinpoche was saying don't rely on the sense consciousnesses. I think perhaps the thing talking about sense consciousness and mental consciousness might be a slightly grosser level for introduction, and then talking about don't rely upon the conceptual consciousness, but rely upon the direct realization of emptiness. So don't rely on the person, but rely on the Dharma. Don't rely on the words of the Dharma, but on the meaning. Don't rely on the interpretable meaning of the Dharma, but the definitive meaning. And that definitive meaning, don't rely on your meditation upon it on a conceptual consciousness, such as an inferential cognizer, or which can realize but doesn't have the immediacy, but rely on direct perception. Does that clear up the? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Venerable, you had a question, I think. Page 189 in the middle. 189. This was one of the people who wrote praise, right? He was someone special. Praise of the Exalted One? I guess so. I don't know they've put it only in Sanskrit, so sometimes we're more familiar with the Tibetan names. This one I'm not familiar with either of the names, but there are various people who wrote praises to the Buddha, having changed from having first entered into, say, the Hindu path, what was called the Vedic path, and then later became Buddhists. And this is apparently one of those people. I'm not sure historically if he's identical to some other people that we know of. One of the people that we know of that wrote praises to the Buddha was Ashvaghosha. You know who Ashvaghosha was? Okay. So he was a similar kind of situation, I think. If I'm not getting the names incorrect, Ashvaghosha was a Hindu scholar, perhaps not this one, but similar, who was debating against the Buddhist monks and was defeated in a famous debate by, I think, Aryadeva. And Aryadeva was the main disciple of Nagarjuna. You probably know all the details of the story you've heard before. And he was, as a result of this, he was placed in a library where there were just Buddhist texts, and he was resistant, even though what the rules were you had to, if you lost the debate, you had to take up the system of the other religion. And he was resistant to do this, but he read the text, and he actually read a prophecy about himself that the Buddha made, that he would convert from non-Buddhist school and write great texts. And he sort of realized that the Buddha was someone more than he thought, and investigated in the same way that this praise talks about comparing the teachings of the non-Buddhist school, what they teach actually. You know, some of the teachings are good, definitely, but there's not all of the teachings that the Buddha taught how to actually attain liberation, how to conquer the delusions by realizing emptiness. There's not always universal compassion. Some religions actually think it's good to, it's okay to kill animals or control animals and so forth, and are completely have no compassion for spirits and so forth. So Ashvaghosha wrote some great praises. So this may be someone like that same kind of situation. I don't know. I can try to research a little for you.
A lot of the non-Buddhist schools?
Only in the context of how they're presented from Buddhism in general. I've studied a little bit about Islam and Christianity and Judaism, like as we have a chance to today in the 20th century world. But the other religions, the other non-Buddhist schools, there are presentations in the tenets when we study philosophical tenets. Okay. So does anyone else have a... Georgia, you have a question? Or was it something about the volume or something?
When Rinpoche was talking about what constitutes the Sangha jewel and mentioning a group of 4 fully ordained monks, would 4 fully ordained nuns constitute the Sangha jewel?
What do you think, Venerable? Are you fully ordained? Are you fully ordained? Are you Bhikshuni? No. Are you fully ordained? No? Venerables? Okay. Venerable, are you fully ordained Bhikshuni? Okay. So from the point of view of the Vinaya, I believe there has to be 4 or more fully ordained monks to constitute a Sangha, because even for the ordination of a Bhikshuni, there had to be 4 monks there for bhikshus. So the main thing about the specialness of 4, like why 4? Why not 3? Or why not 5? Because when an abbot gives an ordination of the Vinaya, like say the novice vows or the fully ordained vows of a monk or nun, there have to be in attendance, besides the presiding teacher, who has to be ordained themselves, has to be fully ordained monk, there has to be 4 or more bhikshus present that provide the various services and who provide the auspiciousness for that person to take ordination. So because of that, that value of having 4 or more monks, 4 or more monks, in general, the Sangha in general, if you make offerings to the Sangha, Rinpoche mentioned yesterday, that the karmic consequences of that are the same as offering to an Arya being, because of the fact that the Sangha have this kind of karmic heaviness. Their presence is necessary for the continuity of the Buddhist teachings, for the continuity of morality, the upholding of the realizational Dharma. Remember we talked about the verbal Dharma and the realizational Dharma? So one of the ways of upholding the realizational Dharma is by taking and keeping ordination. Not just the words of the ceremony or something like that. So because of that, the ability of the 4 or more monks to be able to act as a cause of the upholding of the realizational Dharma, perhaps that's one of the reasons why the heaviness. If you steal from the Sangha, even a thread, or revile or criticize the Sangha, even a little, the heaviness is the same as having criticized an Arya being or having stolen from an Arya being, or if you praise or make offerings to the Sangha. That's why you see the Lamas often making offerings to the Sangha and so forth, because the karma is very heavy.
Wouldn't the realizational upholding of the vows be equal for nuns as a lead for for monks. Actually, nuns have more. The fully ordained nuns have even more.
Yeah, right.
They think that even more so.
Yeah.
They're the upholding
I think
of
so.
Buddhist teachings. So it's
Well, that's not what the Buddha.
patriarchal and sexist.
Yeah, right. You don't have to say to me, I didn't make the rules. As the Buddha, the omniscient Buddha. So I think it's always good to keep that particular kind of mind in how do you say, hold back the critical mind, thinking that it's. I hear people say, Buddhism is patriarchal or sexist, or what's the other word that's used, something like that. Yeah, those are good heavy ones. But if you investigate, if you check deeply, there are reasons for these things. At the time, let's say, for instance, in a patriarchal society where the Buddha appeared, if it was the general karma of people, because this is what was appearing in the world, this is a collective karma, that men were recognized as more powerful. Nowadays things are changing, so it may be that things, maybe we're entering into a more equal age, or maybe eventually there will come a time again in the future where there'll be a matriarchal society. I don't know if the Buddhas appear as universal teachers at that time. I'm not sure. It doesn't say usually it says that the Buddhas, in the sutra teaching, it says the Buddhas appear as a male, as a universal teacher. But it may be that that's just in patriarchal times. But in particular, although there were nuns that took ordination at the time of the Buddha was resistant at first to give ordination, because he foresaw, not because there was anything inferior about the female gender, but he foresaw, because of the collective karma of sentient beings, that if women were ordained, the Dharma would last less long, that particular turning of the wheel. Although he was encouraged to do it, and he did teach, he knew what was going to happen. He knew Ananda would request him and so forth, obviously, being omniscient. And so he did give ordination, but it's said that because of that, the Buddha said at the time when he was actually teaching that the Dharma, because of the karma of sentient beings, because of perhaps being in a patriarchal society, the Dharma would last less long, but he still did that. He saw that was a better course. So I would think it's worth restraining using sort of like the 20th century mindset things. Oh, Buddhism is patriarchal and sexist. Or that sound, investigate a little. It doesn't mean you shouldn't investigate and say, what's the real meaning of this? You should try to find out what the definitive, not the definitive meaning, the ultimate meaning in the end, what the Buddha was getting at, what the point was. A lot of times he led people in various ways, which was appropriate to that time and according to their mentalities. Does that seem suitable answer?
For now.
Okay. So you have to check more. Yeah.
Realizing emptiness. The ultimate wisdom part, I don't really understand. I understand the emptiness part, but not the ultimate wisdom.
In what we were talking about earlier, or in some other context?
This context, and also when Venerable Kirti was here and we were studying the Tantra, Vajrahara and his consort, that they represent.
So you understand emptiness? Okay, so
The inner witness?
no. Well, we say there's two sides of any kind of conscious experience. There's the object that you're conscious of or knowing, and there's the consciousness itself that is knowing that. So a subject, the subject mind, and the object thought, and the object which is being either thought about or realized directly, say, apprehended directly. So in terms of emptiness, emptiness itself is not the mind. Emptiness is an object, a phenomena, the way things are. Like, say, impermanence. Is the mind impermanence? You say, well, wait a second. Sometimes when people don't know English well, they might say, oh yeah, the mind is impermanence, meaning the mind is impermanent. There's a difference between impermanence and impermanent, right? Impermanent, the mind is impermanent. That's its nature. So you could say the mind is impermanent. Would you say the mind is impermanence? What do you think, George? No. What do you think? Why not? Why isn't the mind impermanence? I'm asking you. Right, well, impermanence is a particular phenomena. It's the changing moment by moment. The mind of phenomena that arise because of causes and conditions. The mind itself, it does change moment by moment, but the mind itself has its own defining characteristics, that which is clear and knowing, that which knows phenomena. So the mind is not impermanence, but the mind is impermanent. Does that make sense?
It's one thing. These are both one thing.
What do you mean? The mind?
The mind and
Impermanence?
and
Okay, I'll use that as one example. I'll go then to the other example of the mind realizing emptiness. The mind realizing emptiness directly, as though, not via a mental image, but knowing it directly, which is not something that we're probably doing right now. Something very, very high kind of realization. That kind of consciousness is a wisdom consciousness, so it's called wisdom. That particular consciousness is a wisdom consciousness, and it is called ultimate wisdom. Why? Because its object is the ultimate object of emptiness. So for ourselves, ordinary beings, let's say even Arya beings or high bodhisattvas until the attainment of Buddhahood, that consciousness doesn't realize anything else other than emptiness, that ultimate consciousness. So it's called ultimate, it could be called ultimate consciousness because its object is the ultimate truth, emptiness.
in that moment, then there's the yoga, the union, when it actually is happening.
When we say union,
The subject become one.
yeah, but so there's a little bit difference here when we say the subject and object become one. This is a good point to clear that up. It doesn't mean that at one moment before you've realized emptiness, that your mind was not one with emptiness. It doesn't mean that. Your mind is itself the nature of emptiness. The emptiness is the nature of the mind even before you realize emptiness. So the union of that has a different meaning. It means that at that moment, there is the only thing that is being known. What is being joined is your conscious your conscious apprehension, your conscious consciousness, and the experience of emptiness. It's not as though your consciousness is seeming to be one thing, as though you're looking, like when I'm looking at Venerable Angie here, is that I have a feeling my consciousness is here and Venerable is over there. When you have a union in a non-dual experience, one of the meanings, there are many different levels of it, meaning, but one of the meanings is that the experience of the consciousness is not one that the consciousness is the subject and the object is something other than the consciousness. There's no apprehension at that point. I am apprehending emptiness. There is just the apprehension of emptiness. So it's as though the say, for instance, if you take this, I have a glass of water here. If you were to come and you take a little bit of water and say, I'm going to pour some water in here, and then I say, well, I don't like that water. Take out the water you put in after you stirred it up. It was, I mean, how are you going to do that? It's become inseparable, like water mixed in water, right? So the experience of this ultimate consciousness is one in which the experience is completely pervaded by just knowing emptiness, nothing else. Not thinking I am experiencing emptiness, which is something else. Okay? Okay? Maybe that useful. Okay. So did someone else have a question before we
Days ago, Rinpoche mentioned that the Bodhisattva path practices consisted of two classes. The 6 perfections, which are for ripening oneself, and the 4 ways of gathering for ripening others. I didn't fully understand that. What are the 4 ways of gathering?
So when a person begins to engage in the Bodhisattva activities, the usual thing that we hear is they have to practice the 6 perfections. Actually, there's 10 perfections. All of the 10 perfections are included in the 6. The 6 perfections could be explained with respect to the 10 bhumis that the Bodhisattva progresses through from the point that they realize emptiness directly, from the path of seeing up until they attain just before they attain enlightenment on the 10th bhumi. So the last 4 perfections are included in the 6th one, the perfection of wisdom. So usually we talk about that. So slightly more elaborate, there'd be 10 to ripen the mind of the Bodhisattva themselves. But in order to benefit other sentient beings, the Bodhisattva has to have a relationship that's most beneficial with sentient beings. You have heard several of our lamas mention recently, and it's something that usually gone over my head, even though I heard it many times, of all the Buddha's enlightened activities. This was one of the remember we talked about the qualities of body, speech, and mind, and then the enlightened activities, which included activities of body, speech, and mind, when we talked about refuge here. So of the enlightened activities of the Buddha, the most beneficial, the highest of the enlightened activities is which? The enlightened activity of mind? Which is the highest? Speech? Why speech? Speech is this. No, you're right. Why is speech? Which speech? Turning the wheel of Dharma is considered to be the highest activity. So if you were asked to yourself to try to benefit sentient beings in the greatest way would be able to teach the Dharma explicitly, because that's what can lead them. Of course, acting, a good example, and being kind, making offerings, these things are beneficial, but ultimately you want to be able to lead, to be able to teach them. So these 4 ways of assembling disciples have to do with that leading up to the point, gathering disciples so that you can teach them. So creating karmic conditions by speaking, making offerings to them, giving what is necessary when people have obstacles to being able to hear the teachings. And that would also mean helping them get jobs, get their life together. Giving advice, speaking, as I was saying, speaking kindly, speaking well, being friendly and not acting aloof and so forth. Being something that people can relate to. The more, even though you might know a lot, if you don't have a karmic relationship that people can relate to, you can't actually benefit them. Then giving words of advice when people have particular problems, not necessarily formal teachings, but saying that, why don't you do it this way? If you do that, this will, that's not so good. All of these can be interpreted in many different levels. And then finally, when asked, to give formal teachings, because on the basis of this, having been kind to them materially, speaking kindly, speaking friendly words and so forth, giving advice over time, because of these first 3 ways of assembling disciples, then some people will ask you, can you please teach the Dharma that you've practiced and so forth? And then that is a situation when then these are sort of leading to that kind of situation where you can perform the greatest benefit. So in order to ripen the continua of others, this would be the way of the Bodhisattva progressing that way, so that eventually, as they attain enlightenment, they can spontaneously provide all of these different ways. Even the emanations may have to appear that way. Even the Buddha's emanations, not even after they're no longer training as a bodhisattva, and they're in the path of no more learning, they're a Buddha, they still will emanate and show these kinds of activities, because that's what people relate to. Does that make sense? So when we talk about the 4 ways of assembling disciples, assembling means assembling disciples, a community of people who are, you are in the capacity of leading, like that. So, anyone else have a question? Why don't we spend a couple minutes meditating then on this subject that we've been talking about, on refuge again. Sit comfortably. Try to relax your mind. Relax your body, of course. Relax your mind. Imagine within your mind, within the spaciousness of your mind, letting go of other concepts, maybe the blackness that you seem to be focusing on from your eyes. Just within the spaciousness in front of you, imagine Shakyamuni Buddha, who is our object of refuge. In a sense, his body represents the Buddha's body. His speech, of course, is the Buddha's speech, representing these excellent qualities of turning the wheel of Dharma that people can recognize, and even with one utterance, answering the questions of all sentient beings according to their level of understanding. His mind, the Dharmakaya, having the qualities of knowledge, wisdom, knowing all phenomena, both conventional phenomena and ultimate phenomena, and the quality of his mind of great compassion. What was translated in the text as caring. Actually, tsewa sometimes we translate as mercy. It's a synonym of compassion. Not under the power of ordinary self-interest as we are, always weighing everything up with our own self-interest. The Buddha spontaneously acts out of concern for the suffering of others to alleviate that suffering. And at the same time, loving kindness, wanting them to have the highest happiness, to be endowed with that. So acting in such a way that he can bring that about, that sentient beings from their own side, such as ourself, if our minds have that opening of faith that can allow the, functioning of the Buddha's enlightened activity to enter into our mind, we're sort of in a sense that we're receptive. It's not as though without faith there's some kind of glass barrier or something that the Buddha can't penetrate. The Buddha can enter our mind, obviously, but for us to be receptive to the blessings of the Buddha, we have to have that sense of faith. We have to also be turning our mind away from ordinary concerns, so some fear of cyclic existence. Thinking about the qualities of Buddha, all of the marks of the Buddha were on the Buddha's body. His very body, emanation of light, came about because of accumulation of merit over this enormous period that Shakyamuni practiced as a bodhisattva, 3 countless great eons, always motivated by bodhicitta, always motivated by great compassion. The perfection of his body in that way, not just a result of karma and afflictions as our bodies are, not made of flesh and blood, but an emanation of his mind, these perfect signs, a reflection of his concern and his great accumulation of merit, incredibly beautiful, insatiable to our minds to look at. His speech also we can never hear enough of. see if you can generate these two causes. Mainly, in previous talks, we tried to talk about the cause of fear or apprehension as one of the causes of refuge. If we don't have a feeling that we need help, we're not going to be receptive to it. If you don't recognize that you have cancer or you're not afraid of it, even someone is suggesting various therapies, it will just go in one ear and out the other. If you have fear of that, your mind will be receptive. And if you have faith in the person who is offering advice, you will be receptive to their advice. So we think that we take refuge in Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. In one sense, the Buddha arises from the Dharma. In another sense, the Dharma also arises from the teachings of the Buddhas, the enlightened beings, in any world system. The Sangha are those that, by their practicing of the Dharma, energize us to emulate that same practice, to practice in the same way. They're like nurses to help us take the medicine of the Dharma. So in that way, even mentally, if you try to generate the thought, the actual refuge is the Dharma itself, the realizations that will bring about diminishing of my bad habits and developing of good qualities, benefiting all others and myself. The teacher of the Dharma was the omniscient Buddha, without any faults whatsoever, who taught out of great compassion, out of his own experience, not just theory. And the Arya Sangha, represented by 4 or more monks that can help to prolong the continuity of ordination, to help us take ordination, the first step on that path of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. The Arya Sangha also the Dharma jewel, subdued, encouraging, inspiring, and so forth. So even without necessarily reciting words, also, although that can be done, just having that mind of reliance out of concern, that we ourselves don't know how long we're going to be in cyclic existence, how we can get out by ourselves, simply being clever or whatever. We have to rely on someone who is actually escaped, knows how to get out of cyclic existence from their own experience. Relying on Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha in that way is the actual taking of refuge. I think I'm going to get off the racetrack of samsara. I don't want to take the first step. So I'm going to take refuge in my mind. I'm going to rely from now on, not just on my ordinary pride, my ordinary assertiveness, self-centeredness, my big ego, my desires, my anger, but I'm going to rely on the Dharma, not just as some abstract teaching out there, but the Dharma that I actualize in my own mind that protects me from suffering. My developing of patience, understanding of impermanence, developing of good heart, generosity, forgiveness. This is what I'm going to rely on. And then dedicate the merits of having participated this morning and taken refuge in this way, that we might be cared for by a Mahayana guru in all our lifetimes, bodhisattvas practicing the 6 perfections and the 4 ways of assembling disciples, that in so doing we might quickly develop the conventional and ultimate bodhicitta, conventional mind aspiring to attain enlightenment for the welfare of all sentient beings, motivated by compassion, great compassion. The mind conjoined with that good intention, realizing emptiness, that performs the 6 and 10 perfections, accumulating the causes to benefit sentient beings perfectly, to attain enlightenment for their benefit. This is the starting point, taking refuge. To think, from here, I'm dedicating these merits for that result.